All right, we are going to go ahead and get started with this webinar for the Carbon Removal Challenge. We're very fortunate to be joined here by our special guest, right on time, Michael Weinberg. Uh, Michael's going to be talking to us about the Open Source Hardware Association, about the Open Hardware Summit that's coming up in May, and how we're working with them at OpenAir, and how we are hoping to get the Carbon Removal Challenge involved with that as well. But first, we're going to do just a quick overview of where we're at with the Carbon Removal Challenge. So I'm going to quickly share my screen over here, and then we'll delve in things with Michael. 1 second. So yeah, the Card Removal Challenge is presented by Peter and Erica Reinhardt. We want to do a quick shout out to our sponsors who really make this whole thing possible. If it wasn't for them, would not be able to do this. They're the reason we can provide travel and lodging for the teams to come to the final showcase for the challenge. I want to give special shout outs most notably to our presenting sponsors, Peter and Erica Reinhardt, who are our gigaton level sponsors. We do everything in tonnage because we're a carbon removal competition. I also want to give a shout out to Carbon Unbound. They are our venue sponsor, and they are sort of the leading carbon removal conference in the world. And they have given us a venue to host the challenge that's going to be full of the people who are attending Carbon Unbound. So a great set of people to be investors, mentors, potential companies that the people who are participating in the challenge can meet with at this conference. So thank you so much for Carbon Unbound. If you want to learn more about that, you can check out our webinar that we did earlier with Carbon Unbound, and we did a webinar with Peter Reinhardt as well. So please check those out on our website. We're also very fortunate to have received funding from Activate, New York University, and most recently, X Prize Carbon Removal has joined us in providing sponsorship. They are going to provide a $1,000 prize to each team of finalists. So we're very excited and grateful for them. We also have a great group of sponsors, partners, including the Open Source Hardware Association, that Michael Weinberg is the chairman of the board, on the board. What is it, Michael?
We now on the board. I was the board president for a long time, but I'm very happily no longer the board president because we have a more qualified board president, which was a delightful development in OSHWA history.
So what is your official title at this
So
point?
I'm just a board member.
Just a board member. Okay. Excuse me. Sorry, I didn't mean to put you in two positions. Um, the former chairman of the board, Michael Weinberg, is here to join us to talk about the Open Source Hardware Association, the Open Hardware Summit, which is happening in Montreal, Canada this May, May 2nd and 3rd, 1st and 2nd, the
I
zero.
would I know the answer to that question, but I have to look it up. It's one of my slides. Third and
Very
fourth, third
good.
and fourth, third and
Third
fourth.
tour. Okay, so yeah, if you are interested in going, please do. It's a great event. I've been before, although I think I've only ever been virtually. So I'm excited to go in person this year because Open Air will be there. We're gonna have a table there talking about the Carbon Removal Challenge, maybe some participants in the Carbon Removal Challenge if there are people who are interested in showing the work, and some of the open source hardware work that we're doing at OpenAir, separate from the challenge, but hopefully related to the work that some of you are doing. Um, I do want to say that the challenge is going along very well. We're very happy with our progress so far. We are currently in sort of the mode, the midst of it. This is really the most exciting part for the teams, but the most apprehension filled part for myself and the other people who organize it, because this is the part where we're done with the recruiting. We're just the teams are working away on their projects. If you are participating in the challenge, the deadline reminder for you is March 4th at 9 a.m. Eastern time. It will not be extended. So get your submissions in by March 4th. We just can't extend that deadline because we have our judges lined up for that point. point in time, and then we need to have enough time after the judging is done to invite people and make sure that we can have enough time to get them the accommodations and get them to New York, and hopefully enough time to worry about take care of visa situations as well, which might be a big deal this year, somewhat fortunately, because we're really excited about how international the group of participants we got this year. I think last year we've gone up. I think we had three in Europe last year. We're up to seven European teams. I think we had like three teams from Asia last year. We're up to, I believe, seven from Asia as well. I'm looking at my the spreadsheet right now. Yeah, we've gotten some countries that we didn't have any representation from last year. Asia and Oceania, sorry, Africa and Oceania, we have about the same number of teams. So yeah, we're really excited that this competition is growing and spreading internationally. And thank you to all the attendees who may be members of those teams who came to check it out. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Michael Weinberg, who's going to tell us about the Open Source Hardware Association and the Open Hardware Summit.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt, and thank you, everyone. I am excited to be talking about both of those things here to kind of stealth, not so stealthy, trying to convince you all to more deeply embrace open hardware. I will show my screen because why not? I have slides. That's a thing.
Great. Ooh, they
Okay.
look nice.
Well, only the best, only the best. And that said, I'm sort of here wearing two hats and neither hat in the sense that if I am wrong, it's me. But one is as a member of the board of the Open Source Hardware Association. I've been on the Open Source Hardware Association board for a while, and I'll talk more about the Open Source Hardware Association later. But the Open Source Hardware Association is the kind of community organization that acts as an umbrella organization for the open source hardware, open hardware community. I will use those terms interchangeably today. I encourage you to do the same. There are distinctions to some people I don't think are worth dwelling on. I'm also, when I'm not doing OSHWA things, or sometimes when I am also doing OSHWA things, I'm also the executive director of the Engelberg Center on Innovation, Law, and Policy here at NYU Law. And we do a lot of work on openness, especially open intellectual property issues and kind of sharing. And I'll also touch on some research that the Engelberg Center has done related to open source hardware that I think might be relevant to this group, or that I hope might be relevant to this group later on. So I'll talk a little bit about kind of what open hardware is, when to use it, when not to use it, and some other things to keep in mind. And then excited to kind of talk about this more, take your questions, and explore the parts of this that are most interesting to you all more deeply. So open hardware, what is it and why is it happening now? So I think, open source hardware, the community comes out, as the name suggests, the community comes out of the world of open source software and of open culture, Creative Commons more broadly. And so a lot of people who do open source hardware are doing it or came to it because they were doing something in open source software or in some other kind of open community, and were interested in doing hardware related things and thought, well, I can put these two interests together. Sometimes people think about open source hardware as electronics based, and I think there are a lot of high profile open source hardware projects that are kind of microcontrollery things that use soldering irons. But open source hardware is much broader than that, right? It's much broader than an Arduino or a open source 3D printer or things like that. OSHWA takes a very broad definition of what open source hardware is. And basically, anything that is physical and that is open can be open source hardware. So we've got a little graphic here of different things. And you've got the electronics, you've got jewelry, we've got open source hardware certified hammocks and camping equipment. We've got textiles, we've got instruments. There's someone who's open sourcing a bunch of perfume that is certified as open source hardware. So the world of open source hardware is broad. There's an open source hydrofoil, which is like a surfboard with like a jet on it. So there's like a whole world of open source hardware. Think about it very broadly, even if you might first think about electronic things. Open Source Hardware Association, as I mentioned at the top, is the community organization that was really developed to bring the open source hardware community together. One of the reasons, I mean, obviously, people have been building hardware and physical things since time immemorial and have been sharing those things for just as long. And so when I'm thinking about kind of the modern open source hardware movement, it is a movement that comes out of open source software and open culture. And one of the reasons is because those communities were becoming really vibrant and looking to hardware. Another reason is, especially on the electronic side, electronics just became easier to make. If you, this was a point that Bunny Hung actually made like at one of the first open hardware summits. If you think back even 20, 25, 30 years ago, if you wanted to do something really kind of impactful in electronics, you were going to have a 18-month development cycle, and you needed to kind of have access at the beginning of that cycle to the stuff that was going to be cutting edge 18 months from now when you came out, so you could like do what you wanted to do. There were only a couple of big labs that could do that, and so it was a really kind of small universe. But now we're in this place where the commodity electronics that you can get have easy access to are really powerful and can do really amazing things. And so, you may not be able to get access to an open source version of the chip that is going to drive the newest iPhone, but you can get access to a lot of electronics that can do a lot of interesting things. And also, manufacturing has become easier, smaller scale. It's easier to do kind of one-offs and things like that. And so, when you have the combination of sort of these open communities and ease of manufacturing and ease of using the internet to send design files around, you kind of have this moment of convergence of open source hardware about 15 years ago. And at that moment, the Open Source Hardware Association came together to really try and act as a communing force. And one of the things that OSHWA did first was to create the Open Hardware Summit as a place to come together and talk about and learn about open source hardware. As Matt said, it is coming up. I recommend strongly. It is a great event. So it can be a two-day event this year, May 3rd and 4th. It's just a lot of fun. It's really inspiring. There are talks, there are demo tables. It's just a place to kind of get a sense of what's happening in open source hardware, both the specific projects that are happening and just kind of like the vibe of the open source hardware community. And so if you're in the neighborhood, if you're nearby, I recommend coming on down and saying hello, seeing the talks. Normally this would be the point where I would say, you should submit a talk for the summit, but we already have so many talks. The window has closed. So I would say come this year and then submit a talk for next year is what you should do. But see you at the summit in Montreal. Another thing that OSHWA does is it is the home of the community definition of open source hardware. And so, one of the initial things when the community came together was like, when we're saying open source hardware, what do we mean? And so the definition, which has now been translated into a number of different languages, it lives on the OSHWA site. It acts as a reference point. It was inspired by the OSI, open source software definition, if people are familiar with that. And the idea is to kind of have a central understanding of what it means to be open source hardware. So when you're thinking about developing open source hardware, you have something concrete to kind of work with. Very related to that is the open source hardware certification program. This is a program that we've now been doing for 5 or 6 years now. And it really emerged because, no one owns the term open source hardware, right? So we had this situation where there were people who were creating hardware and saying, this is open source hardware. And people who were, acquiring or building or downloading plans for that hardware and thinking like, this is open source hardware, but their definitions were not always aligned. Sometimes it was a kind of good faith misalignment. Sometimes it was a less good faith misalignment. And so one of the things that OSHWA decided to do is to put together this certification program. The certification program is totally free. And if you have open source hardware that you think meets the community definition, then you could submit your certification. It gets reviewed by the team to make sure that it is. If everything is great, then you get approval, usually in about 2 weeks. When you get approval, you get the right to use the certification logo, which you can see on the slide here. You get a unique identifier that links back to the open source hardware certification directory. And that directory is not a directory of all of the documentation. You can really think about it as a directory of pointers to other documentation. So if you see that logo on hardware, you see a unique identifier, you can use that unique identifier to go to the certification directory and find all the documentation for your hardware. Another benefit of the certification process is that often we have people who come in and say, okay, I'm doing this project. I think I'm doing it right. I'm going to submit it for certification. And like I said, often it's like, great, everything's great. Here's your certification. But sometimes people are missing things. So they're not sure if they have the right documentation or the right licensing. And the certification team will work with you. They won't, if you don't have everything up to snuff on the initial application, they will not say like, you are banished, you can never come back here. They'll reach out and they'll say, hey, this part looks good. This part, if you change it, we can certify you. And so it's a good way to kind of work through, especially if it's your first time doing a project, to make sure that you have, like I said, things like the documentation correct, things that you have the licensing correct. And so you have someone who will kind of work with you to help. And then once you've met the standard and you have the certification logo, you can confidently go to the community and say, I have open source hardware. It's certified open source hardware. I'm sure I'm doing it right. And so it's a really helpful program. That directory is also super helpful because it allows you to find other open source hardware, and you can has sort of a citation feature, so you can trace the history of things. There's also an API you can use to build other things. So the certification program has been really helpful in the last couple of years. Actually, I just used the API this weekend to hack this together. This is the map of certified hardware projects. We've got a couple thousand projects, 60 countries on every continent except Antarctica. I always mention that because I'm waiting for the person who has like a tie to one of the Antarctic research stations to be like, hey, we should certify some hardware. But it really is, it's a global program, and it's really been a great way. I mean, you're talking about, kind of the growth problem of thinking about visas. We think about that a lot at the summit as well. But it's a great opportunity for different parts of the world to say, like, we are part of this global community. We are together. We're doing open source hardware, and we're kind of in dialogue with each other. So it's a great place to check out. It's a great thing to kind of dig into for the certification program. Happy to talk more about that. Well, I want to talk now a little bit more about kind of open hardware and how to think about doing it strategically if you're someone who's running a project or you're someone who's thinking about starting a business. These are two of the research reports that the Engelberg Center has put out related to open source hardware over the last couple of years. The first one is a case study focusing on manufacturing a microscope. And so the idea here was, one of the dreams and the promises of open source hardware is you have a team who is collaborating on a design, but then that design can be manufactured and customized locally in all sorts of different ways. And so the first report was a project and a working group who came together and said, okay, well, how would you really think about this? How would you really implement this? What are the pieces you need to be thinking about? I can't promise you that it has all the answers, but if you are thinking about doing distributed manufacturing, it is a place I would recommend looking to just sort of start building out your checklist of questions you want to answer and how you want to think about structuring your relationship with all the various people in the team. Maybe you have a strong relationship, maybe you don't. There are lots of correct answers, but you want to have answers to a lot of these questions. The other document, and I'm going to draw on this later on, is the Open Source Hardware Weather Report from 2020. And this was built kind of on the 10th anniversary of the Open Hardware Summit. And the idea of this report was to think a little bit about when it made sense, what we've learned about open hardware as a strategy, and when it makes sense to use it, and maybe when it makes sense to not use it. So people who are thinking about this can think about it intentionally. So these are both documents. If you want to check them out, take a look. I'll touch on some of them lightly in the next 5 minutes or so. One of the things that Matt asked me to touch on was the sort of idea of open source hardware in business. And I think that is a really good framework to think about open source hardware. I mentioned at the top that open source hardware comes out of the open source software world, but it's not the same. Software and hardware are different. Hardware is hard. And one of the things that makes hardware different than open source software is that it costs money to make hardware. The dream of open source software is there's no marginal cost. You can distribute it for free. That has deep influences on the culture and the norms and the expectations in that community. With hardware, each one of those pieces costs money to make. And that's baked in from the beginning. And so you don't get the same kind of knee-jerk wariness towards the idea of selling open source hardware that you do in open source software. There are plenty of open source hardware companies that are making tens of millions of dollars a year. And they're doing that because they're using open source hardware as part of their business strategy. And they're deeply embraced by the community. So there's no conflict between open source hardware and business models. We can talk more about those business models if people are interested, but it's just an important thing especially if you're coming from the open source software world, to keep in mind as a difference between open source hardware and open source software. I've alluded to this a couple times, but I've said sort of strategy. Open source hardware, when you're thinking about either a project that's a nonprofit project, that's building a community project, or that is a business, open source hardware is a tool, right? It is not magic. You don't just sort of like throw it up in the air and hope that everything's going to work out. But it's a strategy. It's part of a plan that you need for building your hardware, for building your community, for getting it out in the world. And if you come into it thinking one of the lessons of that weather report is people and communities and organizations who came in and said, we'll just open source it and it'll do whatever it's supposed to do, they got really frustrated. They did not have a lot of success. People who came in and said, no, we're thinking about open source hardware. This is why we were doing it. And we're going to resource the strategy properly. They were much happier. They were much more successful. And so thinking about it as a tool, as a strategy, and not as magic is something that is really important. One other thing I want to mention, going back to this theme of like hardware is not software, hardware is different. One of the really important parts is this idea that it costs money to make the hardware. And so, you like that factors into everyone's relationship. Another thing to think about, again, especially if you're thinking about this in contrast to software, is it really matters who made your hardware. And not just in a kind of like global design standpoint, but in a specific manufacturing standpoint, right? If I have open source software and I download it from 5 different websites, assuming those websites haven't intentionally corrupted the software, it's the same software. If 5 different people download the plans for hardware and make it, it's probably going to be at wildly varying levels of quality. And so that also goes back to that strategy of distribution, of manufacture, of business sometimes, that the design matters, but the build also matters. And you need to think about that as a creator and as a creating community. And you also need to think about that as someone who is receiving open source hardware and using open source hardware, right? It matters where you got it because the physical assembly of the item is going to be highly influential on how it works and what your expectations are. So thinking about this, when does this strategy make sense? I will not go through all these bullets. If you are on this webinar, you are fully literate, but think about these as moments when it makes strategic sense to use open source hardware. And that means using it, and that also means resourcing it, right? You need a plan, you need a plan to execute on that plan. And so when you're thinking about trying to build, that standard reference model that everyone else can build on, open source hardware can be really, really effective. If you have people who want to learn from your hardware or to hack on it or to build on it, then open source hardware can be an incredibly effective way to get that into the world. This non-commodity market one, I think, is also something that's really helpful, right? You can think about open source hardware as being kind of super cheap components and things you can put together, but you can also think about the high end of the market where the customers are going to be really excited about having access to the inners of the hardware because they're like high-end, high-performance customers. And the reason that you can work as a business is because you're the one everyone trusts to actually build the thing. And so thinking about these things, thinking about that documentation as part of your workflow, the public documentation, does that fit in with what you are doing? and or you really do care about building a community. These are all times when this is all in that weather report. These are all times when that's going to be a really effective strategy, right? When open source hardware is going to help advance you towards your larger goals. On the flip side, there are times where open source hardware just doesn't make a lot of sense as a strategy. And that's fine, right? It's like anything else. There are times when it fits, there are times when it doesn't fit. But if you are bringing something physical to a community or a market that does not care about modifying it or building on it or learning how it works, open source hardware may not be the right answer, right? If your development process is at odds with maintaining a public version of your schematics, your plans, all of your design files, then you're going to be like, you're going to create a lot of internal frustration trying to like build this internal version, build this external version, keep them up to date. Everyone's going to be annoyed and unhappy. If you don't want to build that community and you don't want to deal with the community, then open source hardware is not going to work if you don't care about hardware, if you don't care about the community. And then finally, I've touched on this a couple of times. If your marketing strategy is just say it's open source and hope that everything else works, that's not going to work. And you're going to have a lot of people who are very unhappy with you. You're going to be unhappy. And so, thinking about how to use this as a strategy like any other, there's a huge community, there's a huge business community, a huge nonprofit community, education community, all sorts of communities who have found open source hardware can work and work really effectively. But they are the ones who have, by and large, been intentional about it and spent the time to kind of think it through. And so I hope that if you think what you are doing is a good fit for this, you come join the community, but you need to know that that involves making some decisions and deciding to do things with, like I said before, intentionality. So that's kind of like overview of open source hardware. I'm happy to take questions if people have them. I also, last plugs for coming to the summit. Certify your hardware. As I said, certification is free. It's easy. It's fun. You get your unique identifier, you get your logo, and you be in the directory and be on that map. So thanks everyone for paying attention to this initial thing, and I'm happy to answer questions if people have them.
Yeah, that was great, Michael. I really appreciate that, and I think the audience appreciates as well. If you do have any questions, get that into the Q&A now, and we will pass them on to Michael if appropriate. But to kick things off, I'm going to ask you a question that we've discussed before, but I think came up a little bit in this presentation, and I want the audience to get to hear your response to it. So, in one of the slides, you showed the two reports. It came up in a bunch of other slides and other places as well. Most notably that it's called the Open Source Hardware Association, but the summit is called the Open Hardware Summit. So talk a little bit about the sometimes it being open source hardware and sometimes it just being open hardware aspect of this organization.
Yeah, so I mean, there's like not a great answer to that question. And it's easy for me to say because I was not part of the planning for the first Open Hardware Summit or the initial formation of the Open Source Hardware Association. I guess I will say is there are, I mean, this was more true 15 years ago, or whatever it was, 14 years ago, that um, there were other people who had strong opinions about open hardware versus open source hardware. There were a couple other kind of pods of organizations that were moving in kind of parallel, but in slightly different directions. And so I think that the Open Hardware Summit emerged as a kind of umbrella to pull a lot of those together. There may have been some sort of internal politics that pushed towards Open Source Hardware Association. But at this point, I don't think that there is a strong, well, I'll speak for myself. There's not a strong distinction between the two. I really do use the two interchangeably. I think for me, the relevant thing is, do you meet the definition or do you not? And if you do, you can call it open, you can call it open source. I don't have a super strong opinion about it. I don't know. I don't think that OSHWA as an organization has a super strong opinion about it. The key part is, are you sharing those? I mean, what it really comes down to is, are you sharing and making available your design files so people can understand your hardware and can build upon and modify your hardware? So sharing them and licensing them as to allow that. And if you do that, That's what matters, and the terminology is the terminology. And
Yeah, just to be clear, in case the audience is confused, like, well, what's open hardware? What's open source hardware? It's just people use, including
yeah,
people who are very prominent in the community, use them sort of interchangeably to mean the same thing.
yeah. It is not the case. It is not a situation where like there's like one camp that has a definition of open hardware that is different from a different camp that has a definition of open source hardware. If anyone has maintains those distinctions, I don't know them, and I don't know about
And
them.
you're on the board, so it's important to know. Um, so yeah, so you talked about the Open Hardware Summit coming up. That's going to be in Montreal. Is it always in Montreal? Does it like bounce around? What's the deal with the summit? Yeah.
Yeah, no, it definitely travels. It has been, it's mostly in the US. There was one in Rome once that had a whole history to it. This one in Montreal is the first international one since Rome. And Rome was like probably close to 10 years ago now. But it does bounce around the US. The first Open Hardware Summit was here in New York. It's been in New York, it's been in Philadelphia, it has been in Portland, it's been in Boston, it's been in Denver. So it kind of bounces around the US. And I think we're excited. The Rome summit was logistically complicated. And I think that this is an exciting opportunity for OSHWA to go international, right? And to try something because the community is so international that building this out and doing it in Canada this year will be a good test. And then to think through like what does it mean to do the summit internationally? Is there a way to kind of switch off back and forth? But really the goal is to kind of bring the summit to where people are and where a cluster of people are, right? I mean, you think about those places that I mentioned. I mean, the Rome Summit was because there's a giant kind of early maker fair there, but there's a big community of people doing open hardware in Boston and in Portland and in Denver and here in New York. And so the summit is strongest when there's a local community to kind of welcome it and support it. So if you're someone who has thoughts of other locations, please reach out and let us know. But it is not something where it's always the same place every year because the open hardware community is so mobile.
So yeah, I mean, I would have assumed that part of the reason it was in Rome, and probably part of the reason there was a big maker fair there was, the presence of one of the at least more successful, commercially successful open hardware projects, like Arduino, comes out of there. I think it was great you showed that slide of, talking about when to open hardware, when not to open hardware. Can you talk a little bit about the companies that have had the most success being open hardware and, sort of the path that they've taken there?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, there was a bunch of, I mean, if you look at the if you look at the summit sponsors, right, there's a huge list of companies there, and they're companies that are open hardware companies. Arduino is an example. Arduino has a long and rich rich history that is a little bit complicated, but they were certainly like an early trendsetter in that space. You have companies that are electronics companies, especially SparkFun and Adafruit are both very well known. And I think as you think about, if you look at the successful open hardware companies, what you see is basically two things, right? The first is that they are a trusted source for the physical goods, right? If you think about, Arduino is a great example, right? You can buy an Arduino brand Arduino board. You can find all sorts of it, especially at this point, like cheap non-Arduino brand Arduinos. And you might decide that for your purpose, like a cheap Arduino compatible board is like totally adequate. You might decide that you want the Arduino because you're more confident in the build quality or other pieces of it. So there's that component of it. And the other component of it is the kind of documentation and support, right? To say, I trust this company not only to send me what they
Yeah.
what they say they're going to send me, but to show me how to use it when it doesn't work, to help me deal with it. Right? I mean, you see this. I mean, SparkFun and especially Adafruit, they're both like great examples of this, right? Where it's not just a parts catalog. right? There's like a rich set of support, of examples, of projects. And those projects serve as ways to help you think about how to use this stuff and how to learn about using the stuff. And I mean, I certainly speaking for myself, right? I'm not an engineer. I don't have an engineering science background or coding background really. And those kinds of entry points where I said, okay, there's a project. Um, it seems friendly and doable, and I will buy all the parts from these people who are putting the project together because they'll probably work.
Mhm.
And over time, kind of get used to thinking about them as my trusted supplier for those kinds of things. Those are businesses that, both of those businesses, they do, like I said, tens of millions of dollars of turnover every year, because they are trusted. And you talk to someone from Adafruit, they'll talk to you about those tutorials. You talk to people at SparkFun, and they will tell you that they're they have many customers that kind of graduate out of them,
Mm,
right? That come in not being as comfortable with the space. They use that kind of layer to learn how it works. And then many people just stay in that layer, but they have some number of customers who, once they get so comfortable, they start making their own stuff,
mm,
right? And that's fine, right? That's part of their model. And if you ask them why they're open, part of that is to say because we want people to train and build on it, and the communities we deal with are looking for that. But also, part of it is it's like a real cold business decision on where you allocate your resources. Right? I remember when I was working at an organization called Public Knowledge in DC. We had the founder, the then president of SparkFun, come and testify about patents and in front of Congress, and the members of Congress said, well, why, you like this like technology company, why don't you have patents? Why do you hate patents? And he said, like, I don't hate patents.
mm.
But if I'm going to choose between spending $50,000 on a patent that I then have to spend $1 million to enforce against a bunch of companies that I might not be able to touch anyway, or to spend $50,000 on developing the next version of this and documenting it for the community and supporting it, like, just a better investment. And so thinking about that in a kind of real strategic way, I think has been really effective for them.
Yeah, I think that trade-off is something that's lost on people both ways, where people think like, well, why wouldn't you just patent this so that you can just like have control over it? And see, it was like, well, there's a trade-off for that where you're not going to be welcoming certain groups of people in, and they're not going to be able to iterate on it. They're not going to be able to advance it. We've seen certain projects that I think would not have been successful if they were not open the whole time. But then I think sometimes people make the mistake other way, where it's like, oh, I'll just open source it, and that won't cost me anything. It's like, well, like there's a big difference between just like throwing like the instructions and just throwing like the parts list up on GitHub and
Right.
not actually supporting open hardware development on it. Like that's not going to really help you either, um if you
Yeah. I
don't
mean, like the bad
actually.
news is, like, success takes work.
Yeah. Why didn't anyone tell me the key to
I know,
success was
I
hard
know.
work?
So you have to choose where that work is gonna go.
Yeah, it's frustrating. I'm going to ask one more question, then we got questions in the QA. um you mentioned Antarctica, and you showed that great map of all the places where the open hardware projects are going. We too are trying to, the open uh, aspect of the carbon removal challenge. We're trying to get as many teams as possible from many different places as possible. How do you feel like these sort of movements spread? How do you get like, do you feel like, open hardware sort of started in one region, or did it start simultaneously in a bunch of different regions? How did it all sort of come together into this sort of global network?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that it part of it happens kind of organically locally. And so part of the strategy is to find a reason for people who are in kind of a range of places to want to raise their hand and be like, I'm part of this too, right? And like give them a reason to do it and give them an easy way to do it that isn't just, well, I want to be able to color in more squares on my map, right? Like, for me, it would be good if you told me you're doing open hardware. It's like, no, no, no. What can I do to support what you are doing for open hardware. This goes back to like, stuff takes work. What can I do to support you? And then the other thing is to realize that it really is, you think about it internationally it's easy to think about it at the country level because it's like maps are easy to see, but it really is clusters of people. And finding ways to support the small, enthusiastic clusters of people and to talk to them and to understand why they are doing what they're doing and what you can do to help them do more, right? I mean, like if you line up all of the countries that have certified open hardware, one of the countries, I'm sure probably per capita the biggest, but even just absolute numbers, the biggest. Bulgaria is like a total winner on
Wow.
certified open hardware because there are these two open source hardware companies that certify all their stuff. And when they started doing it, one of them started doing it probably 5 years ago now, and we thought of what we could do to support them and to encourage them, and then one became two, and now there's like this whole little cluster, and it's because there's a community there, and they're a community that's connected to themselves and see themselves as connected to the larger open source hardware community, right? There's clear like two or three makerspaces in India that use the certification program as part of their internal, like they have teaching programs to teach young engineering students how to think through engineering processes and how to solve problems. And the last piece of that is to certify their stuff.
That's
There's
great.
there's a hackerspace in the Maldives that does it. That like clearly they just decided like no one knows where we are, so if we certify our stuff, that's how we
Draw
throw
some
our flag
attention.
up,
Yeah.
right? And so like, all these they're different reasons, but they're all kind of small specific communities that had a reason to be boosted if we had a way to bring them in. So I think thinking about the same way of like, how do you get those groups excited and what can you do as a kind of central organization to shine a more of a light on them?
So I'll just give a quick plug before we go to the Q&A that one of the first carbon open source carbon removal project that was certified by the Open Hardware Association was Cyan from the OpenAir Collective. We're hoping that we have about three more projects that are in the works right now that we're hoping to get to a certain point before we apply for certification with those as well. So hopefully we'll have a bunch more in the near future. But there's a question in the Q&A. Thinks a Ton is working on a prototype for a plantable greeting card that sequesters CO2 via biochar and basalt. Could our greeting cards be considered OSHWA, open source hardware, if we publish instructions for how anyone could make them?
Yeah, probably the answer is almost certainly yes. One of the things one, one of the things about open hardware is like complicated is diffuse, right? Like I mentioned at the top. And so this is another place where it kind of in contrast to software, right? Documentation for open source software is super straightforward in most cases, right? It's like publish the code, publish a license, maybe publish a little README, but if the code is there and the license is there, you're fine. And for hardware, what qualifies as documentation is really specific to what it is, right? Documentation for perfume is very different than documentation for a microcontroller. And so as a kind of first step, the thing that you submit, if you think it makes sense, like the team will review it on its own terms. And if it seems like it makes sense, then that's all that you will need. Another piece of this, just to kind of mention how the certification program works, right? We don't have experts in every subfield of creating
Sure.
physical things. And so you can think of the certification program as kind of having two layers, right? There's an initial review layer that is done by essentially non-subject area experts to see if it basically looks right. But there's also a kind of community enforcement layer where after certification, after it's certified, after it's public, someone from the community, and this happens fairly regularly, someone from the community comes in and says, hey, I'm an expert in this, and I'm looking at this documentation, and it actually doesn't tell me how to do this thing.
Yeah, okay.
And one of the roles that OSHWA plays is, so OSHWA will talk to that community member, understand their concern, And sometimes be like, actually, you're just kind of being a troll. So we're going to stick by the certification, which actually I think is like a really important role that we can play for people.
Sure.
But if we think it's a legitimate concern, we'll bring it to the original certifying team and say, hey, we've heard from someone, they have this concern, and try and kind of broker a resolution. And that's a way that we think we can improve the documentation. You can be confident that if you've gone through the process, kind of OSHWA is going to be on your side as a
Mm.
buffer with the community, and that like it will not be the case that you're just going to get it if you're a certifier. You're going to get a call one day and be like, actually, you did this wrong. You have no chance to fix it, and you're kind of being kicked out. And so which is it's the long answer to say yes, like greeting card, compostable greeting card, totally certifiable as open source hardware. Great example, the kind of example that I would love to integrate into future talks. So please do send it.
There you go. Thanks a
And
ton.
yeah, and
Make it
we'll and like
happen.
like I said earlier, like if there's a problem, we will work with you. Right. This is not designed to be something where if you don't do it correctly the first time, you're out. All the time, there's kind of a constant back and forth working through things with people. It's one of the goals of the program.
Let me actually ask a follow-up for that. So let's say, for example, this CO2 capturing greeting card uh, becomes a thing that, Tessera goes back to the Thinks a Ton team and says, hey, this is great. And they say, we want to do this. Would the first step be them taking their best stab at certification based on what they find on the OSHWA.org website? Should they like reach out for like, hey, here's what we're thinking. Can you give us some guidance? Or should they take the channel? What do you think what's the best way to pursue that process?
Yeah. So what I would totally recommend doing is I will put this in the chat is yeah, go to the application. The application is hopefully pretty straightforward and pretty lightweight. Um, the certification site actually has a lot of information about documentation and licensing, especially in the kind of what is certification area. But yeah, the first step is if you have the stuff that's public, submit the application. The application is free for a reason.
Mm.
And if you work through it, then you're probably pretty close. It asks you questions for a reason. It's free for a reason. And so, yeah, send it in. And the worst thing that happens is you get an email from someone. You can get an email from me that says, thanks for sending this in. This part looks like it's great. And this part we have questions about. Let's talk about it.
It's great. Yeah, I think it's great that it's sort of a simple process. You just sort of take your best stab at it, and then you get support in getting it in more. And I think, it's something where there's a sense of like, oh, I'm open sourcing this. I'm like, why am I giving it away for free? It's like, well, just because you told people how to do it, not most people are not going to just do it on their own rather than just pay for the thing. Um,
Yeah.
but the benefit you get is the people who do take it and make their own, they're probably going to find out some improvements. They're probably going to find out something that's better, some way to do it differently, something that's going to improve your process. And we've seen that in so many different open hardware
Constantly. Yeah.
situations. But I think the 3D printing is sort of the go-to example for that, where it's like there would not be the consumer grade 3D printing industry the way it exists now. I remember when I was, I went to a school that had the people on the forefront of things like 3D printing. So I would tell people about 3D printers, 15 years ago, and they think I was talking about something from Star Trek and they didn't think it was real. And now my mom, knows what a 3D printer
Yeah.
is, right? Like it's just that industry is taken off so much, but it would never have gotten here if it wasn't for all these people who are super excited and invested in it, trying to make them better and then contributing back to the projects to make them
Right. And
advance.
trusting that process, right? Like
Yeah.
because the 3D printer was open source, they knew that if they shared their improvement, if it was a good improvement, it would be integrated into the new version,
Yep.
and that version would be available for them to keep hacking on. They wouldn't feel like they were chumps, like telling some company how to fix the problem. And the company's like, great, we're going to take that information and patent it and take it from you, right? It's like a much more contributory and iterative process with the open structure.
And that's what we're hoping for with all these open hardware projects that OpenAir is doing. Hopefully, for these people who are contributing to the carbon removal challenge, to decide that that's the right direction for you. It's not required for the carbon removal challenge, and we know a lot of students are at schools that they are required to have proprietary IP, and we're not pushing anyone to do anything that they don't feel comfortable with. But if you decide to go the open hardware approach, it is work in some ways, but it has benefits as well, and it sort of offsets some of the other
It's
work.
less work than a patent application.
Yeah, definitely getting certified by OSHWA is less work and cheaper than the patent application.
Cheaper, yeah.
There's other effort that has to go into it, but it's only cheaper than that. There's no question about that. And so yeah, and so the sort of uh, biodegradable CO2 capturing greeting card, yeah, that's an example of something where like, maybe somebody helps you, you're selling those, but maybe somebody finds a way to get more biochar in there, and then it becomes that much more effective, and the product goes further. Or you use a different kind of plant seed in there, and then it grows much faster or better, and that captures more CO2. So yeah, if you're watching this webinar live, or if you're watching the recording, yeah, please check out this stuff, and hopefully we can get more cool climate friendly, especially carbon removal friendly, carbon removal open hardware projects out there in the world. I'm gonna say open hardware. It's just shorter. Why put
It's
the
just
source?
hard. It's yes, it's shorter, it's easier. It's like the S makes OSHWA easier to say.
Oh, OWA? Would it be?
OWA
Oh,
would be harder. So
why is
like
the W there? Couldn't it be just
I know
OHA? The W hardware is one word.
I cannot be held responsible for this.
I think it should be OHA, but
Write in with your
yeah,
alternate acronym name for OSHWA. Uh,
I'm sure it'll have a huge impact. I don't know if they're open sourcing the name of the organization, but
we will consider a pull request to the
yeah,
name.
it could just be O. Yeah, to SARS is just, yeah, it could be O. You just leave off the association. O is not bad. I can give you that. Okay. I think that's about all the time we have for today. So thank you so much, Michael, for joining us. That was great and really helpful. Thank you for the audience that came in and asked questions and listened to this talk. And we're gonna put this recording up on our website. So feel to share this with anyone you think might be interested. It should be up there by the end of the week. So thank you very much. And that is our webinar for today.
Thanks, everybody.